Hi, it's a pleasure to make this presentation about our efforts to fuel new research on the causes and consequences of bankruptcy and on historical credit markets. Our objective is to digitize data from a nationally representative sample of original case files and to encode those data for widespread use. We begin by briefly reviewing the importance of the problem of bankruptcy and noting significant gaps in our knowledge about it. We argue that understanding bankruptcy and historical credit markets is a subject that's been held back by the limitations of available data, and that our project is critical in advancing research on these important, timely, and policy-relevant issues. It's really difficult to overstate the importance of understanding bankruptcy. This graph shows the personal bankruptcy rate in the United States from 1900 in the bottom corner to 2009. Before World War II, it's easy to see that bankruptcy was a rare event. In 1938, for example, there were just 3 petitions for personal bankruptcy for every 10,000 people in the country. But by the end of this time series in 2005, the personal bankruptcy rate reached 6 per 1,000 people. Because most people who file for bankruptcy receive a discharge of their unsecured debts, bankruptcy now has the potential to transfer more resources from creditors to debtors than Medicaid transfers from taxpayers to the poor and uninsured. And this figure leaves out the thousands of businesses that file every year. So just to set the stage, let's talk a little bit about bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is an enumerated power of Congress. It's mentioned specifically in the Constitution. There were 3 temporary laws in the 19th century. Each of those was eventually repealed or had a sunset clause. The first permanent law was passed in 1898, and there has been a continuous bankruptcy law in place ever since. That law has been reformed in 1978 and in 2005. Bankruptcy comes in 2 flavors. One is involuntary bankruptcy. This is where a creditor files a petition because the debtor hasn't paid. This kind of bankruptcy applies to businesses only, and today it's very rare, although at the beginning of the 20th century it was not rare. Voluntary bankruptcy refers to bringing oneself to the court and asking to be declared a bankrupt. The reason people do this is because they want to stop traditional creditors' remedies such as garnishment. Whether the bankruptcy is involuntary or voluntary, the process allows any assets that the debtor has to be divided on a pro rata basis that is equally between creditors who have similar priorities of debt. So because this is such an important topic, it really has been studied quite a bit. Attempts to understand the decision to file by scholars in law, including now Senator Elizabeth Warren, and in economics, including especially Michelle White, and in sociology, including Teresa Sullivan, now president of the University of Virginia, have all underscored the complexity of bankruptcy. We've learned that the letter of the federal bankruptcy law and the choices states make under that law matter. We've also learned that the operations of circuit and district courts matter. We've learned that other laws governing the relationship between creditors and debtors, especially state garnishment laws and procedures, matter a lot to the bankruptcy decision. We've learned that bankruptcy law affects both the demand and the supply of credit. But there are a lot of things that we don't understand about bankruptcy at all. For example, we can't fully explain why people choose to use the bankruptcy law, despite all that research. We don't understand what causes the bankruptcy rates to rise. We can't accurately describe the relationship between the business cycle or financial crises and the bankruptcy rate. We don't understand the relationship between long-run economic growth and bankruptcy. And we can't accurately describe, much less explain, long-run trends in bankruptcy among women or minorities. We argue that research on bankruptcy and on historical credit markets more generally has been held back by data that are weak relative to the importance of these issues. So, what data do we have? Let's first talk about the ideal data. The ideal data to study long-run trends in bankruptcy and credit markets would be detailed. It would have lots of information about the finances of filers and the creditors. Ideal data would include a nationally representative group of filers. It would have countrywide geographic coverage that includes observations at a local level from individual courts. It would cover a long time period, and it would be available for scholars to use very widely. So, as shown in the table, the existing data are far from ideal. Right now, there are 4 main sources of data: the panel survey of income dynamics, data on credit card holders, survey data, and case file data from the Consumer Bankruptcy Project and from the federal court integrated databases. As you can see here in the table, none of these data sources has all of the desirable or ideal characteristics. Our case file data set, however, is detailed. It will have really detailed information about the debtors and the creditors. It will cover the whole country. It will be nationally representative across that whole country. It will stretch back to 1898 and will make it available through the ICPSR. Let's talk a little bit about those original court case files. Most of the files from before World War II are already in the National Archives. So they're available for researchers to look at. Newer files, and the exact date differs by court, are currently in the federal record centers. We helped the archives develop a sampling methodology to preserve 2.5% of these records from the federal record centers from each court. These case files are going to be brought into the collection of the National Archives, where they'll be eventually available to us. So a lot of people know these case files are there, but very few researchers have exploited them. They're really pretty hard to access. They're spread all over the country, although a bulk of them is now in Kansas City. And really the files are hard to use. You really have to know what you're looking for and what you're looking at when you open these case files. We will digitize, encode, and distribute up to 1/3 of the saved case files in this project. So the goal overall is a 1% sample of all case files, about 315,000. We're aiming to get 30 to 1,000 cases from each local court in each year. The breakdown between personal, or historically they were called wage earner cases, and business cases is shown here. We hope to get about 227,000 personal cases and about 88,000 business cases. Of course, the final sample size is going to depend on the success we have in fundraising for this project. So let's talk about how our project can be the basis for constructing really ideal data to talk about many aspects of bankruptcy and credit markets. And we'll talk about the process that we use to get to these data. Our first step is to photograph the documents from our sample of case files in partnership with the National Archives. We take those photographs and we put them in a format, a database format, to maximize the usefulness of the end product to answer questions across disciplines. We engaged an interdisciplinary team of researchers to identify the information to extract from the digitized case files. So that format, after we've scraped the data out of the photograph case files, using a data conversion firm, of course, we will have our bankruptcy data set. I want to stop here for a moment and talk about the ethical issues in this research. The court records are public documents, and the collection of these data are not subject to regulation. But because the data set will contain personally identifying information, people's names and their addresses and their debts and assets, its distribution will be subject to laws protecting human subjects in research. In order to make it feasible to widely distribute this restricted use data set, we will use the ICPSR, the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, as a data repository. The ICPSR is one of the most experienced repositories in distributing these types of data. We'll also make available for widespread research a version of the data that's stripped of identifying information to make it easier to use. So this is what we will do, but much more can be done by us and by others in the future. So we can take this bankruptcy data set because it has identifying information and because it's a long run sample, and we can add other data to it. Two kinds of data come immediately to mind. First, the courts began to roll out digital records in the mid-1990s. These records can be added to our data to keep it continuously up to date. And second, because we have this identifying information, it would be possible to link to a wide variety of data by name or other identifiers such as Social Security number. So, for example, the case files could be linked with Social Security Administration or IRS data to obtain work history and other detailed demographic data. While these kinds of projects are regulated, they're feasible. With our data set as a foundation, then, researchers from many disciplines will be able to push understanding of bankruptcy and credit markets forward. So again, the data set includes information that's really detailed. About debtors, we know the name, where they were when they filed. We can find out their occupation. We'll know about their income and pre-filing circumstances. We'll find out a great deal about what they own, their assets, and what they owe, their debts, in quite a bit of detail. We also know a lot about the creditors. We know the names and locations of these creditors, so we can figure out what kinds of businesses they are, or individuals. And we also know quite a bit about the court processes that these cases go through. So we have, for example, dates of benchmarks in the case. And we know the names of the people involved in the case. So to sum up, we've talked quite a lot about how the bankruptcy data are good investment in research. We've surveyed scholars through our professional listservs. An overwhelming percentage of those who respond would consider using these data. And each scholar who responded to our survey has a research idea that we hadn't previously considered. So, in our opinion, the academic possibilities are inestimably large. The impact of this project, though, will be felt far beyond academia. We conclude this presentation with two examples of the broad impact this project will have. First, on policy. We can't yet answer basic questions about bankruptcy, and therefore we can't really anticipate the effects of proposed changes in credit law. The Dodd-Frank Act is likely to have a direct impact on household balance sheets and bankruptcy rates. A lot of analysts have conjectured about the effect of the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, for example. Right now, it's only possible to conjecture. Our data set will allow careful study of policy proposals that mimic proposals in the past. Second, research using our data set will help consumer advocates design materials for financial education. Especially useful will be the ability to define target populations. For example, suppose that the data show that minority debtors underuse bankruptcy protection, and consequently they lose more of their assets in collection than white debtors. Racial disparities in bankruptcy might be then exacerbating inequalities in wealth. Newly armed with this kind of detailed information, consumer advocates can design materials for minority audiences to educate them about the benefits of bankruptcy and therefore remediate racial inequality. Again, every audience we speak with has a problem they feel our data can help solve. And we hope you'll use our data sometime too. Look for them at the ICPSR. Thank you.